In 2004, when Robert Booth Nichols appeared in Australia to make threats against me, I had actually discovered that Alexander Haig owned Commodore International, a company registered in both Canada and the Bahamas, with a co-director who was the former attorney of Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited in the Bahamas. The company was founded by Robert Calvi, Michael Sindona, and also Archbishop Paul Masinkas, head of the Vatican Bank. I'm going to reveal to you the links of Michael Sindona, Robert Calvi, Paul Masinkas, and the attorney, whose name is Ralph Seligman, who's a 33rd degree Mason, living in the Bahamas, who was the attorney to Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited. I will confirm the links of Michael Sindona with John Gambino, biggest distributor from Sicily to New York with the Gambino Mafia, for the distribution of heroin trafficked throughout Turkey, from Turkey to Italy and into the USA through New York. In previous podcasts, I confirmed that I had interviewed Dee Ferdinand, the daughter of Albert V. Carone, Colonel Albert V. Carone, who was the bagman for CIA, personally known and had a relationship with William Colby and William Casey. And William Casey was the godfather to Dee Ferdinand's son. Their links, Dee Ferdinand confirmed the categoric links of the CIA, both directors, William Casey, William Colby, direct with her father, Albert V. Carone, with the Gambino Mafia for laundering the drugs for CIA with the Gambino Mafia, distributing the drugs throughout USA. In addition, Dee Ferdinand confirms categorically that she was introduced to Ted Shackley by Robert Mayhew, who was the director of Fidco, with George Pender, Robert Booth Nichols, Clint Murchison, and Robert Booth Nichols being the liaison for the Gambino Mafia, the Medellin cartel, and also the Yakuza for the distribution and money laundering of drugs worldwide, including the money laundering of Ferdinand Marcos's gold bullion through the banks of Switzerland. So we have independent verification now that I'm going to show you that when Michael Sindona was in prison, he wrote a letter personally to President Reagan, who was a member of the Sovereign Knights of Malta, anointed by Peter Grace, in terms of the support that he was looking for to confirm his role that he played as the director of Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited and also the Franklin Bank for laundering the funds required by CIA for supporting the Iran-Contra arms and drugs transactions. The letter goes on to confirm that he's going to subpoena Alexander Haig and also Stanford Turner, who was the director of CIA, and David Kennedy to verify the role that he was asked to play. But more importantly, his link with the Gambino Mafia for distribution of heroin and money laundering of their funds in collaboration with CIA is indisputable. So who was Michael Sindona? Well, he was known in the banking circles as the Shark. Sindona was a member of Propaganda Due, which was the P2 Lodge, a secret lodge of Italian Freemasonry, and had a clear connections to the Sicilian mafia. He was fatally poisoned in prison after writing his letter to President Reagan. He had been convicted for fraud and also the assassination and murder of the lawyer Giorgio Ambrosoli and his collaboration with the Gambino Mafia. He had a life sentence, but mysteriously was fatally poisoned. So we have the links of Michele Sindona, Robert Calvi, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, Carlo Presenti with the P2 Lodge, but also a secret Catholic church organisation called the Sint Unum, which is supported by the Knights of Malta together with Opus Dei and linked to the Crown Prince of Austria, the last family member for the Roman Empire, who are the founders, all of them are the founders of the Cercle and the Six Eye, which was supported and endorsed by our world order now means in effect the establishment of compatible priorities, our Mr. Kissinger, billionaire David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Vernon Walters, Deputy Director of CIA and a Knights of Malta, William Wilson, Knights of Malta, and became the ambassador to the Vatican, Alexander Haig, a sovereign Knights of Malta and a member of the P2 Lodge, and of course the person in the middle of all of this that seems to be the glue and the personal advisor of both Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley is Michael Ledeen and Ted Shackley himself, all members and affiliated with the Cercle, the Six Eye and the P2 Lodge, and of course using the Bank of the Vatican Bank, IOR, and the banker Ambrosiano as the vehicle for laundering the funds for solidarity in Poland and also for arming the Iran-Contra in Nicaragua and other terrorist organizations in Central America. So now let's look specifically at the relationships between Michele Sindona, Robert Calvi, Paul Marcinkus, and their attorney, a third-degree Mason, Ralph Seligman, together with White House, with the members of President Reagan, Alexander Haig, CIA Director Stanford Turner, and David Kennedy, and the definitive link with the Gambino Mafia for the distribution and money laundering of heroin as part of their arms for drugs transactions leading Iran-Contra scandal and also the financing of terrorism. But did it start in the 80s? No, it went right back to the 70s. So here is a press release. The Italian Banks Unit votes to liquidate. Dated 1982. The Italian Banks Unit votes to liquidate shareholders of Banca Ambrosiana's Bahamas subsidiary have voted to liquidate voluntarily the bank. And who makes the announcement? Ralph Seligman. Cancel for Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited in Bahamas. Said on Tuesday the petition will be presented soon asking for voluntary liquidation under supervision of the Supreme Court of the Bahamas Bar. Ambrosio Nassau, the Bahamas, the authorities here have suspended the license of Banca Ambrosiano Overseas Limited for 30 days following the inability of the Italian parent company, Banco Ambrosiano, to make declaration in support of overseas subsidiaries. The Bahamas Central Bank said the suspension had been ordered to give Banca Ambrosiano Overseas time to restore satisfactory liquidity to its operations. Banco Ambrosiano overseas was established in Nassau last July but had operated as an offshore bank since 1971 as Kiss Alpine Overseas Limited. Please make a note of the name Kiss Alpine Overseas Limited because it has significance to CIA operations of money laundering, drugs and arms with the Nugan Bank. It turns out that Marcinkus, Paul Marcinkus, is among 23 sought by Italy. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the Vatican banker, faces indictment with 22 other priests and laymen on charges that contributed to the collapse in 1982 of Italy's biggest private bank, Banco Ambrosiano. Judicial sources said Thursday the sources said arrest warrants will be issued soon for the priests and laymen, all associated with the Institute for Religious Works, known as IOR, commonly known as the Vatican Bank. The witness has identified as Francesco Pazienza, an informer in many recent financial cases who was a close collaborator of the late Robert Calvi, president of Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge in London, shortly after the official receiver found a $1.3 billion deficit in the accounts of his bank. According to new evidence, Archbishop Marcinkus not only provided 2 letters of patronage for Calvi, but the Vatican Bank obtained shares in the bank's foreign dealings with Kiss Alpine Overseas Bank in Nassau, Bahamas. Although the Vatican Bank owned only 2% of Banco Ambrosiano, investigators alleged that it owned large interests in Calvi's overseas ventures, financed with bank funds illegally smuggled out of Italy through the Vatican Bank. The investigators have alleged that Calvi used the 2 letters of patronage given to him by Archbishop Marcinkus in the late 1970s to raise money for his overseas deals. These deals with post-box companies in Liechtenstein, Panama and Nassau led to the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. Isn't that just wonderful? Well, when we do research on Cisalpine Bank, Bahamas, we find that Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, were dealing with the Nugan Bank. What a surprise. World Finance Corporation was a financial corporation founded in 1971 and headquarters in Coral Gables, Florida, when the WFC Corp was headed and controlled by Guillermo Hernandez Cartaya, a former Cuban banker who was an agent of CIA, isn't it a surprise, and believed to be an agent of the mafia, and also various Colombian drug lords. Through the WFC group, Shell Company became known of a major financial scandal in which over $50 million was lost. This scandal was the subject of a 60-minute segment aired on the 26th of February 1978. So as you can see, the history of Banco Ambrosiano, together with the P2 Lodge, with Shackley's drugs and arms cartels, with the mafia, preceded the 1980s and the election of President Ronald Reagan. It says here that Cartier controlled it through a number of shell companies, the most well-known of which was this WFC group, or the World Finance Corporation. WFC came to national attention when an investigation in 1976 by the District Attorney of Dade County, Florida, along with 4 other governmental agencies besides the Dade Country Public Safety Office, the FBI, the IRS and DEA, and the Comptroller of Currency all participated in a joint investigation, revealed that WFC held the dubious distinction of being the longest running and largest launderer of money for the Colombian cocaine smugglers. The investigation proceeded for approximately 2 years. So there's the history. Banca Ambrosiana, registered in the Bahamas, had acted as the Cisalpine Bank since 1971, is linked to CIA and the money laundering of the Colombian cocaine smugglers. It goes on to say that somewhat ironically, the law enforcement personnel literally stumbled onto lead when during an investigation of a pest control service called King Spray Service, suspected of drug smuggling, two agents of Dade County Public Safety Office, which under Donald Skelton led the investigation and the Justice Department took over, were searching through the company's garbage, in which they found financial records of WFC, recording very large transfers of funds between the bank and the company, along with small amounts of marijuana. The investigation ruined WFC Corp, and it closed in 1980 due to this scandal. Simultaneously, overdrafts at the National Bank of South Florida, controlled by WFC, after a large payment of cash for equity, prompted an investigation by bank examiners. This is the key part. A considerable proportion of the money was funneled through a bank in the Bahamas called the Cisalpine Bank, hence the origins of Banca Ambrosiana Overseas Limited, and from thence to the Vatican Bank, two Swiss numbered accounts. This bank was owned by the Vatican Bank. The manager was Archbishop Paul Smasinkas, and notoriously dirty Italian banker Robert Calvi. The Cisalpine Bank seems to have also been laundering heroin profits through the Nugan Bank for the Grey Wolves. And this part's very important. My previous podcasts have definitively shown the drug distribution of heroin, together with the largest arms with the mafia in Italy, was linked to Michael Hand and his associates. If you recall, in my podcast, I had definitively shown the history of the Nugan Bank with Michael Hand, his links with Task Force 157 from the Office of Naval Intelligence, together with Ted Shackley and Ed Wilson, were laundering the drugs through the Cabazon Casino, headed by John P. Nichols, with the Gambino Mafia, Thomas Marsden, located at Wackenhut with Cabazon Arms, Meridian Arms, with Robert Burt Nichols, and also involved the recovery technologies of Paul Marascus and Michael Riconosciuto. The records clearly show the laundering of money and drugs and arms through the Nugan Bank, and also linked to a company called Hamadan Proprietary Limited with Donald Lockyer, connected to the Gambino Mafia, and a secret Knights of Malta Foundation, and Southern Goldfields with Peter Briggs, who was subpoenaed and convicted during the Royal Costigan inquiry into drugs and arms and money laundering involving the Painters and Dockers Union in Australia. I also showed in previous podcasts the definitive historical links of Eastco at 777 Leesburg Pike, Virginia, in the building owned by the Viggory Company, with Richard Viggory, who leads the propaganda group, media group, fundraising group for the Republican Party. And in the building was Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, Eric von Marbod, and our friend and central figure for P2 Lodge and the Cercle is Michael Ledeen. I showed the history of the companies they were working with. Ed Wilson had also set up J and J Capucci and Associates, and Operational Systems Inc. And it got exposed in domestic spying on demonstrators to nuclear facilities in California, and had to shut down, and all of its grants with the law enforcement agency grant system was then assigned across with all their programmers to a company called Simcom Inc., owned by Earl Bryan, with Hadron Inc., and they developed the fusion of all intelligence databases across CIA, DIA, NSA, State Department, NSC, with Wang Labs, Computer Power Group, and then developed the SAFE, Swift banking software called Iris Swift Banking. Not only that, they were involved in all the development of the integrated command and control systems for intelligence at DEA with Lucien Conein, who has a long relationship with Ted Shackley, John Sinlaub, and Richard Secord, and so therefore it was the Fox looking after the hen house, allowing them to have all intelligence on who are the competitors to their drug empire, so they can have them arrested, shut down, and control all drugs distribution through the USA. It also linked across to Gray & Co. with Robert Gray, Robert Owen, Neil Livingston, and Daniel Murphy, who had served as the Chief of Staff to President George Bush Sr., who flies to Panama to have a private meeting with Manuel Noriega. A very tight circle. I also showed that not only had they infiltrated the DEA intelligence systems, but they were also developing all the software and radar systems for the Aerostat AWAC drug interdiction program for the war on drugs and terror, headed by Vice President George Bush, former director of CIA. So it really became the Fox in charge of the hen house. But they're laundering all the drugs through Nugan Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, BCCI, and Citibank, and using the Swift banking network set up by Wang Labs in partnership with Hadron Inc., Earl Bryan, and also Computer Power Group and News Limited with Rupert Murdoch. I've also detailed in previous podcasts the overwhelming evidence that this secret team was also using the Holy Alliance with the Vatican in its alliance with Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, in the name of God, selling arms and drugs to fascist leaders worldwide, terrorist groups that are, all they have to say is they're anti-communist, and they will sell them all the arms, assist them to assassinate people, finance them, and at the end of the day, they couldn't pay for these arms, but they could with the drugs. So the drugs was money, and as long as the secret team is controlling the drug network internationally, it knows that it's collateral. And so it can launder it through the banks of the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiano, and a collection of banks, particularly Citibank. So now let's focus on the link. The relationship of Michele Sindona, Robert Calvi, Paul Masinkas, and a 30-degree Mason, who's the attorney of Banca Ambrosiano, and their relationship with John Gambino, laundering the drugs in the name of national security with Alexander Haig, Stanford Turner, David Kennedy, and the blessing of President Reagan with his Holy Alliance with the Pope, or the Vatican. So we have overwhelming evidence that Cisalpine Bank, Bahamas, Banca Ambrosiana, Vatican Bank and the Guggenheim Bank. The evidence was the investigation and its aftermath were marred and dogged by persistent rumours and allegations of corruption and cover-ups by various government agencies. Jonathan Whitney writes, this is of the Justice Department's head investigator, Jeremy Sanford. He says the main investigation was halted by Washington in 1978 after the CIA objected that 12 of the Justice Department chief's targets were of interest to it. That's all it takes. In the name of national security, we shut down evidence of money laundering and the biggest distribution of drugs with the Gambino Mafia into USA to sell to children of families and ruin their lives. Sanford says he was told that this meant the men he was investigating were CIA operatives of one sort or another. Florida lawmen who worked with Sanford backed up his story. Two of the suspects were Richard Fincher and Hernandez Carteo. In the aftermath, Florida Attorney General Robert Shevin returned $7,600 in contributions from WFC-connected Latin businessman Dade County Democrat Chairman Michael Abrams resigned from the board of WFC-backed insurance company. Whitney and Sanford were not the only ones to detect things amiss. Whitney offers this exact extract from House Select Committee on Narcotics and Drug Abuse staff report. There is no question that the parameters of WFC can encompass a large body of criminal activity, including aspects of political corruption, gun running, as well as narcotics trafficking on an international level. Please look at that. It's not just the USA, it's the international level of drug trafficking, gun running, and political corruption. It is against this background that our investigation encountered a number of veiled or direct references to CIA or KGB, complicity or involvement in narcotics trafficking in South Florida. So you can find that both sides of the West's fight against communism and the KGB itself were financing all of their gun running and political corruption using narcotics. There were also allegations that 8 of the 12 bank directors were either current or former CIA employees, and that then CIA Director William Casey, coincidentally a Roman Catholic. Don't you like this? Independent of all my research from the very beginning, he can pick up the link here. Apparently stymied the investigation for reasons of, quote, national security, end quote. And so the 2-year investigation ended in the conviction of Cartier in 1982 for nothing more than tax evasion. Isn't this amazing that it's a common thread, a common theme, a common outcome? When the mafia is involved, and particularly the bosses, John Gotti, anyone in head of the mafia who's involved in drugs, murder, gun running, assassinations, we can't convict them because they're working with CIA. So the only thing we can convict them on is, can we find any evidence that they haven't paid their tax? And so the only vehicle for getting them convicted and put in prison seems to be the IRS. If you don't pay your taxes, it's the worst crime that you commit on the planet Earth. Lyndon LaRouche famously published a book called Dope Inc. And this is what he was exposing in 1985 On June 20, 1985, Venezuelan magazine reported a story alleging that a member of Venezuela's Cisneros family, one of the most powerful moneyed families, was up to its neck in dope money laundering in Florida. According to the story, taken wholly from the left-wing journalist Penny Lennox's book In Banks We Trust, Oswaldo Cisneros Fajardo had associated with the World Finance Corporation, WFC, an international money laundering mat. Caught in one scam too many, the WFC eventually collapsed, and its Cuban-American president, Guillermo Hernandez Cartaya, landed in jail on lesser charges of income tax evasion. Details of the seamier side of WFC Operation Arms for Drugs in the Caribbean, financial capabilities made available by Castro government in Cuba, were included in the story. Interest was heightened by the fact that a Caracas newspaper had just printed a picture of Venezuela's President Lucinchi reading the Lennox book with two of his advisors. The caption inserted that the readers were concentrating on the Cisneros link to the drug world. This provoked as much outrage as if Newsweek had accused David Rockefeller of laundering dirty money. Heaven forbid. The organisation Diego Cisneros, the Cisneros family holding company, published full-page advertisements in the Caracas press denying any connection to the World Finance Corporation. Credible or Hernandez Cartaya, Oswaldo Cisneros, in an interview with Resume magazine telling his side of the story, admitted he had hired Hernandez Cartaya in 1975 to reorganize the investment company. Inversiones Fernex, later renamed Credible, and that the two had jointly incorporated a subsidiary of WFC, isn't that amazing, in Caracas. But he insisted that he was the last of their business association, and that he had no knowledge that Hernandez Cartaya was involved in drugs or drug money laundering. So we are finding here that former CIA agents running banks are laundering drugs. What a shock. It goes on to say a Cuban exile banker named Hernandez Cartaya founded WFC in 1971 in Coral Gables, Florida. Cartaya had some sort of intelligence connection from the beginning. He fought in the Bay of Pigs invasion, hence linked to Robert Mayhew and Ted Shackley, was captured, released and went to work for the Citizens and Southern Bank of Atlanta until he left to set up his own shop. WFC's lawyers, whose signature appears on WFC's incorporation papers, was well-connected former, wait for it, OSS operative Walter Sterling Surrey, who remained with WFC until 1976. Surrey was also the lawyer for Ronald Stark, a terrorist now jailed in Italy. Isn't this amazing? Connection with banking, CIA and representing terrorists in Italy for the ties to the Red Brigades. Stark, before his activities in Italy within narco-terrorist circles, had been a member of Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Keep that in mind, because that comes up quite consistently with the connections with P2 Lodge and the Vatican Bank, and an organisation involved in producing most of the hallucinogenic drugs peddled in the United States through the 1970s. Goes on to say that the Brotherhood was one of the first drug running and money laundering channels into the United States from the Caribbean and Central America. The article from Linda LaRouche's research shows that WFC's ties into major narcotic traffickers were extensive. DEA files record one of Cartea's closest associates was a narcotics wholesaler working with Santos Trafficante mafia group. Now this name just keeps coming up and up with Ted Shackley, Robert Mayhew, Bay of Pigs, and also the Golden Triangle heroin distribution into the USA from Vietnam, Golden Triangle. In any case, a finance company linked to Trafficante, known as Dominion Mortgage Corporation, listed its offices at the same address as Cartea's WFC company. The DEA also claimed that a WFC employee named Heinrich Kaki Argomanis was a suspected drug and gun runner and the brother of a known drug wholesaler, Alberto Agromanis. So look at this circle here, how tight. We have a holy alliance set up with the Vatican to fight communism. We have an intimate link between the Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited, the Vatican Bank, with Alexander Haig, CIA, US Treasury, and a direct relationship with John Gambino, identified as the largest heroin trafficker from distribution from Turkey into Italy and then into the United States with the Gambino family in New York, who have direct relationships with Albert V. Carone, who's the bagman and personal friend of William Casey, William Colby, and Ted Shackley. In my research in 2004, unbeknown to anyone worldwide, I had uncovered in my research on these matters that there was a company called Commodore International Limited in the Bahamas and also Canada. And on the board, the directors were Alexander Haig and Ralph D. Seligman, the 30-degree Mason, who's the personal attorney to Michele Sindona, Robert Calvi, and Archbishop Paul Masinkas for the Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited. That is not a coincidence that Robert Booth Nichols appears suddenly in Australia making threats against me, given my research into PROMIS, that I'm upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, that I'll get a crowbar to the back of my head, or the military will come down on me if I continue my research. But all my research leads to Alexander Haig, and the day that he appears, I then get a telephone call immediately, within an hour of getting home, from a leading journalist telling me that he's just learnt that Michael Ledeen is in Melbourne as a guest speaker to an Israeli Chamber of Commerce. And Michael Ledeen is the personal advisor to Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley. So this evidence here is definitive. It's legally endorsed in documentation and evidence that the Holy Alliance set up between President Reagan and the Pope has authorized basically a green light for State Department, Alexander Haig, CIA, US Treasury to be embroiled in the money laundering of arms in the name of fighting communism in Poland and Central America and Italy, where the payments for the arms will be financed through its alliance with the Gambino Mafia. involving William Colby, William Casey, Albert V. Carone, Ted Shackley, together with Robert Mayhew. So who is John Gambino? Well, he was an Italian-born American mobster. Born in Sicily, he became a made member of the Gambino crime family in 1975 and captain and head of the crime family's Sicilian faction. He was appointed by John Gotti, the Gambino boss, in 1986, according to turncoat Sammy Gravano. What was his business? Heroin trafficking. Despite a ban on drug dealing, the Gambinos were heavily involved in international heroin trafficking out of Bensonhurst. John Gambino was the converging point in the United States for a consortium of heroin traffickers of the Sicilian Mafia, composed of the Inzarello family and Stefano Bontard, and the final destination for its shipments of heroin that was refined in laboratories in Sicily from Turkish morphine base. His relative Salvatore Inzarello was the Gambino's brother's principal interlocutor, the central personage in Sicily, with myriads interests and heavy capital investments. This is part's very important. How do you launder the funds? Not just through banks, but acquisitions of stock market. Companies registered on the stock market. Giovanni Falcone, the investigating magistrate who was assigned to investigate the heroin trafficking case in 1980, estimated that by late 1970s, the Inzarello Gambino Spatola network was smuggling over 600 million worth of heroin into the US every year. Money laundering was the name of the game. John Gambino had close relationships with the Italian banker Michele Sindona. They dined often and openly at luxurious Hotel Pierre on the Fifth Avenue or the Gambino's Cafe Valentino. Gambino was frequent guest at New York dinner parties in Sindona's honour. When Sindona got into trouble and was indicted for the bankruptcy of Franklin National Bank, it was John Gambino procured a false passport and helped to stage a bogus kidnap in August 1979 to conceal a mysterious 11-week trip to Sicily before his scheduled fraud trial. However, Sindona also had put the mafia's heroin money at risk due to his financial malpractice. The real purpose of the kidnapping was to issue sparsely a disguised blackmail notes to Sindona's past political allies, among them Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, to engineer the rescue of his banks and recuperate Cosa Nostra's money. Gambino accompanied Sindona's attempt to recover the money, but the plans failed and Sindona was arrested, leading to the indictment of Inzarello Spatola Gambino network. It remains unclear if any of the mafia money Sindona had lost was ever recovered. Indicted in 1980 in relation with heroin traffic network, John Gambino was convicted and sentenced to 6.5 years jail sentence for heroin traffic in Palermo. The sentence in absentia was confirmed by Italy's Supreme Court in 1985. And this is the amazing part. No one's ever convicted when you work with CIA. You seem to be warned, advised, and mysteriously hidden. However, Gambino remained free because the US did not agree with the Italian request for extradition. Isn't that amazing? John and Joe Gambino were acquitted in 1984 New Jersey drug case in which their brother Rosario was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Due to testimonies of mafia turncoats such as Sammy Gravano of the New York Gambino crime family and Francesco Mariano Manoia, an Italian pentito who has become a government witness, Joe and John Gambino and 6 other defendants, including Francesco Inzarello, were indicted on charges they smuggled and distributed drugs, operated a number of organised crime enterprises, and took part in a 1988 murder of Francesco Oliverio. However, the brothers failed to appear at their arraignment on September 1st, 1992 at the Federal District Court in Manhattan, forfeiting $5 million bail. And this is the mystery. Electronic monitoring bracelets intended to keep track of them had been removed with the approval of the US government in July that year. This is just incredible. In February 1993, the trial against John and Joe Gambino and their associates Lorenzo Mannino and Matteo Romano started. The prosecution portrayed them as main distributors of heroin smuggled from Italy and South America to Miami and New York by the Sicilian Mafia, while the defense countered that central drug and murder charges in the case were based on uncorroborated testimony of Marino Mannio and Gravano, whom the defence depicted as killers and liars. The trial ended in mistrial in June 1993 when a jury was unable to reach a verdict on charges of racketeering, drug trafficking and murder. This is a protection racket. Marino Mannio was admitted into the Witness Protection Program in the United States. Italy had no such program at the time. He testified he had met with John Gambino personally, who had inspected the quality of the heroin, and Marino Mannio was refining in Palermo. His testimony finally induced the Gambinos to plead guilty to drug trafficking in an arrangement with prosecution. The pentito Gaspar Mortolo revealed that he organised a 400-kilogram shipment of heroin to the US in 1981. The Quintera Caruna Mafia clan received half of the load while John Gambino took possession of the other 200 kilograms. The shipments were financed by a consortium of Sicilian mafia clans who had organised a pool to provide the money to buy merchandise from Thai suppliers, hence the Golden Triangle with Ted Shackley. Within a year of the Gambino families choosing him to manage their heroin profits, Sindona had brought his first bank. He also became a friend of Pope Giovanni Battista Montini. Montini was at the time Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Milan and Cardinal. By the time Montini became Pope Paul IV, Sindona had acquired through his holding company Fasco, a company called Fasco, many more Italian banks, and his progress continued right up to the beginning of association with the Vatican Bank commencing in 1969. Huge amounts of money moved from Sindona's banks through the Vatican to Swiss banks, and he began speculating against major currencies on a large scale. So in the name of God, the mafia can launder their funds and buy currencies and stock. In 1972, Sindona purchased controlling interest in Long Island's Franklin National Bank from Lawrence Tisch. He was hailed as the saviour of the lira and was named Man of the Year in January 1974 by the US Ambassador to Italy, John Volpe. But that April, a sudden stock market crash led to what is known as Two Crack Sindona, the Sindona bankrupt. The Franklin's Bank profit fell by as much as 98% compared to the previous year, and Sindona suffered a $40 million loss. Consequently, began losing most of the banks and he had acquired over previous 17 years. On October 1974, the bank was declared insolvent due to mismanagement and fraud, involving losses in foreign currency speculation and poor loan policies. Part of the losses involved Sindona's transfer of $30 million of bank funds to Europe to recover his losses. According to the Mafia Pentito, repentant, Francisco Marino Manio, Sindona laundered the proceeds of heroin trafficking for the Bontade, Spatola, Inzarello, Gambino network. The mafiosa were determined to get their money back and would play an important role in Sindona's attempt to save his banks. So we have Michele Sindona in prison, laundering funds for the CIA to buy arms using the proceeds of drugs with all the cartels, Mafia, Medellin cartel, the Golden Triangle, through Banca Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, and the Guggenheim Bank. And he's writing to President Reagan asking for his personal assistance, given that he believes that he has been loyal to Italy and America in their fight against communism, sanctioned by Alexander Haig, Secretary of State, and Stanford Turner, Director of CIA, and David Kennedy, former US Secretary of Treasury. And here's his letter. I managed to find a copy of his original letter. It's dated September 7th, 1981. So during Alexander Haig's appointment as Secretary of State, the history of the 70s is now coming back to haunt him. Addressed to the President of the United States, President Reagan, he introduces himself as Michele Sindona. He gives details of his federal prison number, Springfield, Missouri. My number is 00450-054. He's now, I appeal to you, Mr. President. He goes on to talk about the fact that he's been loyal to America, and he says, since I recall that during the last days of your campaign you declared that you were roused to shame and pity by the Vietnamese who, in attempting to escape from communist persecution, had written on the outside of their fragile crafts, is this what happens to the friends of the United States of America? You assured the world that this country would not permit an episode like this to be repeated, that never again could one say that the United States of America respects its enemies and abandons its friends. He goes on to say, I feel that I've always been a friend of the United States. I've been persecuted by the Italian left just because I have struggled with all my might for the respect of the Italian constitution and for the election of a truly democratic government which would honour the treaties of alliance and with the Western countries, especially the United States. Many important figures in US government are aware of my struggles for the preservation of freedom in Italy and the Western world. I now wish to list below some of these people so that if you choose, you will be able to verify that what I say is the truth. And he goes on to say, number 1, the former US Ambassador to Italy, Mr. Graham Martin, has declared to my lawyers John Kirby and Robert Casanoff that I am an Italian patriot and a loyal friend of the United States. He says he is quite aware of my efforts and how I fought for many years to spare the United States of the loss of Italy as an ally, which could mean the strategic loss of the entire Mediterranean region. He knows that in 1971 I purchased, upon his suggestion, the only Italian newspaper in the English language, the Rome Daily American, in order to prevent it falling into the hands of the Italian left, and he knows that in order to keep such publication alive I bore serious financial losses. Mr. Martin knows that I was given the Man of the Year award by the American Club of Rome for the efforts that I made to increase political and economic relations between Italy and the United States. The award was delivered to me in 1974 by the Ambassador Volpi, who had replaced Martin a short time before in Italy. He then goes on to say that Mr. Martin knows too that I maintain and cause to maintain contacts between chiefs of staff of the two countries to consolidate an alliance that was being substantially undermined by the Italian leftists, who from late 1960s were driving force in the Italian government, primarily deciding on economic and military policies. Mr. Martin and I together studied the possibilities for taking away control of the press and the television from the Italian leftists, and the resulting plan was submitted to White House. He knows that I was harassed by the Italian leftists for my efforts such as these, and that I risked my life on several occasions, as happens among those who strongly oppose their ideology. This is further evidence that the neo-fascist groups behind the secret team want to control the media, to control perception of the public, to support the far-right values. Former Secretary of Treasury and former Ambassador David Kennedy, who followed my financial activity directly and through his employers, often told me that he always considered my work to be carried out above reproach. Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company of Chicago, of which Kennedy was chairman, was for many years a partner of Banca Privata Finanziaria of Milan, which I controlled. A representative of Continental was elected executive officer of Banca Privata Finanziaria, and Kennedy himself was a director of FASCO International, the holding company owned by me, which purchased 21% of Franklin National Bank of New York and 53% of a company called Talcott Corp. Sindona goes on to say to President Reagan, after a long period of active and close cooperation, David Kennedy can verify that I always acted in accordance with the law, not only state law but also moral law. He knows that I fought to maintain and better to advance Italy as a democratic country, a faithful ally of the United States. To David Kennedy I proposed positive plans to reach this goal, and among which was one, to gain, with help of United States, control of some important press organs. So there you go, controlling the propaganda. When Kennedy was Secretary of the Treasury, I told him in Washington, in the presence of Mr. Aldo Sammaritani, Vice President of the Italian Industrialists Association, that the Italian entrepreneurs were willing to cooperate with the United States government in the fight against the Italian left, in reaching the agreements to guarantee free enterprise to Italy, and in giving the United States the reassurance of being able to rely on a loyal ally in Europe. David Kennedy knows that I fought to avoid the total collectivization of the Italian economy. He knows, because he told me this himself, that Mr. Guido Carli, then Governor of Banca d'Italia, corresponds to your Chairman of the Federal Reserve, isn't that interesting? Stated during a meeting of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, that he would owe it to me if he was able to maintain a certain balance between private and public enterprise. Macaulay Sindona, in his letter to the President, continues, Kennedy knows of my series of lectures at important American universities aiming to convince students and teachers that the defence of the dollar was a necessity that should not be disregarded, that aid to developing countries was to be given without jeopardising the solidity of the American banking system, and that it was necessary to demand that country members of the IMF abide by all agreements reached by the preservation of an orderly international monetary system. On many occasions I record to my audience what was said appropriately enough by Lenin, that it is that the disintegration of capitalism, brackets, and of a Western civilization, close brackets, will originate with the fall of the monetary system. Through Kennedy, then Secretary of the Treasury, I advised the Nixon administration against the devaluation of the dollar in 1971. But the devaluation was subsequently carried out, with the result of the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries reaped huge profits, brackets, mainly earmarked for weapons development, close brackets. I know that the Soviet Union sold or gave orders to, quote, sell short, close quote, mostly through a brokerage company controlled by me, about $20 billion in the 3-week period preceding the devaluation. This is the beginning of confirmation of Macaulay Sindona's understanding of the US wanting to control the IMF, the World Bank and the world banking systems, and also prevent the Soviet Union in acquiring Western technology for weapons development, so that the US will maintain a superiority. Macaulay Sindona continues in his letter to the President Ronald Reagan, Rear Admiral Max Morris had the opportunity to read my lectures, which were given at the American universities, and to know my ideas of the international political, financial and military situation. I stated my plans to free Italy from the yoke of the leftists, and he told me that he agreed that the United States, by losing Italy, would lose control of the entire Mediterranean region. Admiral Morris told me in a letter dated September 20th, 1978, that he had shown my remarks on communist monetary manipulations to Admiral Stanford Turner, then head of CIA. He later told me that he spoke of my case and about my projects with Admiral Turner and with the present Secretary of State Alexander Haig Jr., at the time Commander-in-Chief of NATO. In a letter dated December 13, 1978, Admiral Morris mentions a high-ranking military figure and a similarly high-level person in the intelligence field, which he verbally confirmed to me to be Haig and Turner, as having demonstrated an attentive interest in my ideas and plans, and says that he certainly urged them to carry the matter further and to contact him or me for further details. He then ended the letter with these words, all of us, I know, appreciate your efforts on behalf of this country and of the West, close quotes. Michel Sindona, in his letter to the President, continues, the conduct of my defence attorneys in this trial was incomprehensible. They, Joseph O'Terry and Martin Weinberg of Boston, knew perfectly well the truth regarding my disappearance. They knew I had not left voluntarily, and knew that I had never had anything to do with organised crime. They also knew that in this instance I had functioned as a patriot of my country against Italian leftists. They subpoenaed Rear Admiral Max K. Morris, former director of CIA Stanford Turner, former Commander-in-Chief of NATO forces and now Secretary of State Alexander Haig Jr., former Ambassador to Italy Graham Martin, former Secretary of Treasury, David Kennedy, and other renowned powerful figures of the economic and political importance. These men all would be able to testify for my firm and long-standing commitment to the democratic ideals and for my continuous efforts with the US government against Soviet expansionism. Particularly, Haig and Turner would have been asked to disclose the details of the conversation they had with Admiral Morris in my regard to and to discuss the results of the research I know they did on my background. Macaulay Sindona continues with his letter of President Ronald Reagan. Mr. President, with the power entrusted you, you could easily obtain any FBI or CIA files that might exist about me. You will easily discover that I was never involved or even suspected of being involved with racketeering, drug smuggling, prostitution or any other crimes, usually related to organised crime. The mafia-related accusations against me were simply inferred by the press and instigated by my enemies on the basis of my being Sicilian and having acquired great wealth during my career. The US attorney knew perfectly well that no files existed neither within the FBI nor with the local New York police nor with the Italian police that could connect me in any way with organised crime. They investigated me for 5 years with countless trips to Italy. They learned there that I started my career as a tax and corporate lawyer, and I soon became tax advisor for many influential Italian families. That I represented major industrial and commercial associations in Italy and created a corporate law firm, which eventually became the largest and most prestigious in the country. They knew that through my experience as a corporate attorney, I became an expert in mergers and acquisitions. He goes on to say to President Reagan, they learned that I organised some of the largest acquisitions of major Italian public corporations in association with members of the international financial establishment. They knew that throughout my career I earned legally and by hard work great sums of money that eventually I became the largest private banker in Italy. My actual career can be easily traced. It's now history and cannot be altered or erased. My clients and my partners are also easily traceable. Some of the most prestigious firms were associated with me during the financial operations, including Continental, Illinois National Bank and Trust Company of Chicago, Hambros Bank of London, Banca de Paris et des Pays Bas, the Vatican, and others. Now, despite all they have learned over the years of investigation, the US attorneys prefer to believe and tell the courts the fictions of second-rate Italian tabloids, which narrate that I started my career selling fruits and vegetables, came to Milan with mafia money, brought myself a law degree, but never really practiced the legal profession, and got involved in a few dishonest but successful speculations. He goes on to say in his letter to President Reagan, suddenly, when the trial was already in advanced stage and the government was close to resting its case, my lawyers reversed their strategy. They decided not to put up a defence, reasoning that this would have surprised the government. According to their theory, the government had not brought any evidence that could have proven my guilt beyond reasonable doubt. I agreed with the fact that the evidence was insufficient, but I also knew by then that it would not take any evidence convince an American jury to convict Macaulay Sindona, the infamous Italian banker swindler. By the time my attorneys reached this decision, I had already begun to lose confidence in them. When I originally approached them, they had shown great understanding of my plight and appeared outraged by such injustices. After reading many documents germane to my case, they pleaded their unconditional support for as long as it would serve me. They agreed to subpoena anyone whose testimony could have helped me. They also said to me, politicians, Pentagon officials, ambassadors, and of course you, McCallie, will testify to show the world what you have done for the United States. We will win this trial and we will easily obtain a review of the first trial for bankruptcy. We will not be influenced by any political pressure and will even subpoena Secretary Haig. Don't you like that? This time, you will finally have the chance to express your side and the public will finally know the truth. What statesmanship! They knew how desperate I was at that point. They knew that they were telling me what I wanted to hear. And so finally, McCallie Sindona, in his letter to President Ronald Reagan, in another attempt to justify the decision to not let me testify, my lawyers explained to some members of my family that the real reason for their last-minute decision was to avoid a cross-examination of me regarding John Gambino. I had never hidden my relationship with Mr. Gambino, the sole aim of which was political. We were introduced as recently as 1977 through Mr. Mario Salinelli or the Italian television network in hopes of establishing a newspaper for the Italian-American community. I had previously discussed this matter with my attorneys and they knew that there was no reason for me to fear a cross-examination on this issue. This all came up the day before U.S. Attorney was to rest his case. Therefore, I had no chance to take steps toward my preferred action. I was found guilty. It is true that the government had not proven my guilt, nor could they do so, since I had not committed any crime. However, the jury, influenced by anti-Sindona propaganda, became convinced that they were facing a criminal, an Italian criminal at that, who apparently was afraid to take the stand. It is well known that the emphasis on the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution is hypocritical. And so, not perceiving the real meaning of, beyond any reasonable doubt, and taking refuge in the knowledge that the law they were not required to account for the decision, they acted solely on their instincts and found me guilty. Unfortunately, the jury's decision is incontrovertible. One is left to appeal the rulings of the court. And summing up, at the same time, he says to President Reagan, the prosecutor mentioned my contacts with John Gambino during my disappearance, which was supposed to have been connected with my will to commit felonies in collaboration with organised crime during that period. What a spurious process of reasoning by one who claims to represent the law of this country. To allude that my relationship with John Gambino assures my involvement with organised crime is completely unfounded. As far as this country's justice is concerned, John Gambino has never been convicted of any crime. His only offence was to have been born the nephew of the late infamous Carlo Gambino, the alleged boss of all bosses. He will continue to plead his case with President Reagan. He's going through several points in detail that Tendi was convinced that I had important information about organised crime, that the attorneys from the US Department were pressuring him to plead guilty and cut a deal so they could convict John Gambino, which he says he refused to do. It's going to be open to conjecture, but given that Robert Calvi later is dead, given that key witnesses relating to banker Ambrosiano with CIA and the mafia are dead, it's realistic to assume that Sindona knew that if he was to do a plea bargain, it'd be his death anyway. If he was pleading against John Gambino and the CIA and their involvement in the selling of heroin into the USA in exchange for arms that they're selling to the Iran-Contras, Central America, and also terrorist groups throughout Europe, particularly Italy. So he goes through, in this particular slide here, the activities to reduce the communist votes in Italy. He's saying that John Gambino was patriotic and was willing to assist him politically, but I think it becomes quite clear in subsequent years that the argument was that Michele Sindona was laundering the heroin funds of John Gambino, and his kidnapping, which wasn't voluntary by the Gambinos, was to put political pressure on the leadership of the government of Italy that they wanted their money back, even if it was used for fighting communism. They knew that Sindona had the dirt on the politicians, particularly links to the P2 Lodge. And so he finalises his little summaries here. When my lawyers told me that Tendi, after first session, did not believe me, the prosecuting attorney, that all my plea bargaining efforts had failed and that I had best resign myself to spending the rest of my life in jail, Mr. Tendi came back to the attack and informed me. Through my attorney, Mr. Rosner, Mr. Frankel was also aware of this proposal, that I could, during my second and final scheduled questioning, have a chance to change all of that he, Mr. Tendi, would provide me with a passport of the country of my choice, in a name of my liking, where I could live the rest of my life in peace, if only I could provide him with incriminating evidence against John Gambino. I again testified to Mr. Tendi, and my position remained unchanged. How easy it could have been for me to accept the bait from Tendi and cooperate in fabricating stories against John Gambino, as was done by Bordoni and Kenny against me. Had I done so, Mr. Gambino would now be unjustly in prison and I would be free. Bordoni, who did agree to this offer, is now free, spending the $40 million he stole from my banks while I'm incarcerated. Unfortunately for Mr. Tendi, my morality is not flexible as Mr. Bordoni's is, and therefore his plan did not work. I believe that subsequent years, evidence even from informers within the Gambino, confirmed that John Gambino was involved in the trafficking of heroin and money laundering through Michele Sindina's banks. It was not the first time that I received the sort of proposal. At the beginning of the investigation of the collapse of Franklin National Bank, Mr. Kenny immediately began to hunt for important prey that would give him prestige, so he avidly sought. The name of David Kennedy presented the opportunity he was seeking. Mr. Kennedy's prestigious position in the American financial community, in particular having served as the Secretary of Treasury, made him a prime target. A conviction of such a high-caliber figure would secure a successful career for the aspiring defence attorney John Kenny. I was only number 2 on his hit list, and he was more than willing to trade me for David Kennedy. Italy has a vital need to restore the 3 values that Gilbert defines in wealth and poverty as indispensable elements of survival of a democratic country: work, family and faith. In Italy, the leftist influence and propaganda has destroyed these values, and along with them has destroyed democracy and the fabric of state itself. No one wants to work anymore, since they are confident that the welfare state will support them with debts in American dollars. The once healthy Italian family is now just a memory, and faith, once a significant stabilizing factor, has been lost by the Italians. Corruption, pervading every facet of Italian life, has destroyed the belief in any moral value, human or divine. And he closes off, "It heartens me," when he speaks in his letter to President Ronald Reagan, "it heartens me when I see that finally you are trying to curb the threatening advance of Marxist ideas. And most of us know that you need loyal allies in this struggle. But this loyalty must be earned and deserved. As long as unlimited power in this country is given to the likes of the Greases, the Kennys and the Tendies, to people by their actions desecrate the beautiful American flag, you may again soon witness other boats of refugees stranded in stormy seas and hear their plaintive cry, 'Is this what happens to the friends of United States of America?' Respectfully yours, Michele Sindona." I can identify with that last paragraph. In my own personal experience as being loyal to the institutions of the United States, believing that the United States is our ally and our friend, to be betrayed by the Johns Hopkins institutions, to be portrayed as untrustworthy, not credible after representing them from 1995 through to 1999, with being the sole representative of the Spirus Rosetta encryption technologies used by CIA and NSA. I witnessed personally how they destroy their own allies to cover up their own fraud, deception, corruption, and lies. I feel that his statement is true, whilst I may not condone that he's money laundering the heroin sales of the Gambino Mafia with CIA, but he believed that he was being loyal to the United States. And clearly they were not loyal to him, and it covered up the whole affair of the links of Alexander Haig, CIA, with P2 Lodge, banker Ambrosiano, Vatican Bank being used to launder drugs and arms in the name of God through their holy alliance with the Vatican and the Pope. And so these press releases dated 1986. Michele Sindona, jailed Italian financier, dies of cyanide poisoning at 65. You can't help but see the parallel story for Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein linked with the Rothschilds and Mossad with Operation Compromise blackmail, pedophiles, ring, linked to Clinton, William Clinton, president, leaders of government, politicians, the royal family of England. Also, when being convicted, a vial of cyanide is secretly transported into the prison and causes a so-called suicide. a suicide of Jeffrey Epstein, an embarrassment to the highest powers of the land, and Michele Sindona, clearly in his letter threatening to subpoena former Secretary of State, Director of CIA, and putting in writing his concerns to the President of the United States. Most important thing is that it was an embarrassment to the banking elite. The Franklin National Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, the Vatican Bank, CIA, and White House. This article, 1986 as well, Michele Sindona, jailed Italian financier, dies of cyanide poisoning at 65. The links were found between him and the mafia, as well as the secret P2 Lodge, a bogus Masonic lodge that the Italian Parliament recently branded as a subversive organisation. Mr. Sindona parlayed his expertise as a tax lawyer and accountant into holdings that in his heyday were estimated to total as much as 450 million and were scattered through a maze of banks and industries. He was living a life of opulence then in Milan. Mr. Sindona's financial prowess was so esteemed that at the recommendations of the prominent Catholic layman Pope Paul IV sought his advice on Vatican investments. Leading Italian politicians gave him access to government circles in Rome. Later he would say the same politicians were the architects of his undoing. There is overwhelming evidence of the P2 Lodge, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, its links with the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, links with NSC, CIA, White House, laundering drugs with the mafia and the Medellin cartels to pay for the arms that they're illegally selling to terrorist groups worldwide and the Iran-Contra rebels. Money laundering heroin into the United States to poison the veins of the young people, the young citizens, the young children of families, in the name of a holy alliance, in the name of God, for fighting communism, is considered a national security of our elite leaders and the secret team. The evidence is overwhelming that this was the brainchild of David Rockefeller, William Casey, Brzezinski, Vernon Walters, William Wilson, Alexander Haig, Ted Shackley, and more importantly, the man that bridged it all together in Italy with the P2 Lodge, with Lucia Gelli, with Carlo Presenti, with Crown Prince Otto of Austria, for the alliance involving the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and the P2 Lodge, is Michael Ledeen. With his links with not only Italian intelligence and CIA, but also with Mossad. He's not a double spy, he's a triple spy. But it's in the name of establishing a new world order, in the name to fight, a holy alliance to fight against communist subversion with the Catholic Church, and it started with a secret group known as Sint Unum, headed by Carlo Presenti, who was vice president of Banca Ambrosiana, and financially supporting neo-fascist and neo-Nazi groups in Italy with links to Otto Skorzeny, Nazi assassin who rescued Mussolini in the Second World War, employed by the Mossad to help Mossad train their assassins used in Vietnam with CIA and Central America and Spain to assassinate and remove threats to the USA and Israel. The evidence is overwhelming that the same people for this secret team, Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Edward Wilson, Richard Secord, Eric von Bout, and Michael Ledeen, had their relationship in Eastco, together with a propaganda company set up by Richard Vigory, aligned with Robert Gray, Gray & Co., with Daniel Murphy, Joseph Capucci, Neil Livingston, Robert Owen, and of course Earl Bryan, who owned Simcom and Hadron Inc., and acquired all the team of Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, and Joseph Capucci's company and programmers that had developed Operational Systems Inc., which was caught red-handed spying on citizens of the United States secretly who were anti-nuclear protesters, and then had to shut down the company urgently, and they were developing the fusion of intelligence databases with the Law Enforcement Intelligence Unit under a LEA grant, the biggest database on domestic citizens, and then the team continues to do the development of the CIA DIA SAFE software, which became Iris with banking software, and they also developed all the intelligence systems used by their friend Lucien Conin, who heads the intelligence unit on all drug cartels and distribution of drugs into and out of USA, and the systems that they developed internally with the PROMIS software for money laundering through the SWIFT network. The command control systems, it's the same secret team. William Casey was the brains of economic warfare, the alliance set up with the Vatican Bank, together with Ted Shackley, George Bush Sr., also Fedco board headed by George Pender, and of course Frank Colucci. The overlap and reach of their companies, Wackenhut, Fedco, Eastco, also controlled the CIA Counter-Terrorism Center. So George Bush's war on drugs and terrorism was the fox looking after the hen house. They had infiltrated all the banks, controlled and developed all of the fusion of intelligence databases and law enforcement and military databases for the interdiction program for the drug cartels with the aerostats and AWACS, but they also, being the fox in charge of the hen house, providing radar detection and beacons, they could allow their sanctioned drug deliveries to proceed under the guise of intelligence and national security identification to fly in and out of the United States and Australia and worldwide free of interdiction and investigation. They controlled the drug cartels. Lucien Conin ensured that the intelligence was to shut down all competitors to their Golden Triangle links, the Medellin and Cali cartels' domination with Noriega and Pablo Escobar, and also the Gambino, Sicilian links for the heroin, coming in from Turkey and Lebanon through Italy back into the United States. It's the same team, beginning with William Colby, Ted Shackley, Frank Gallucci, Henry Kissinger, together with Robert Booth Nichols, Michael Hand. They spearheaded the $4 billion Arab loan for the political assassination of the Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, the Australian Federal Treasurer Jim Cairns, using MI5 former agents Sir Harry Gillam and Eric Sear Cowles. It was a joint operation to politically assassinate their ally, the Australian government. Just repeat that was definitely the evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating, and it was provided to him by Michael Riconosciuto, and he provided his evidence direct to me, which allowed me to definitively prove the evidence. It's not just the word of Michael, it turns out the legal evidence substantiates from the Australian records of my investigations. And the most important thing now is that there's overwhelming evidence that the Cercle and the 6i, the private intelligence security agency group internationally, set up by them, is being controlled by the neocons. Henry Kissinger, Seven Kramer, son of Fritz Kramer, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Michael Ledeen. Hence, the warning that William Hamilton provided in 2004, just before Paul Wolfowitz is appointed as the new president of the World Bank, that Paul Wolfowitz is leading the charge of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby to shut down my investigations on the PROMIS software. It's clear that the evidence linking them back to the Cercle, 6i, and their relationships with Alexander Haig, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, together with the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei and P2 Lodge, money laundering operations extended into Pentagon, which I am going to reveal to you in this podcast. So who was Sven Kramer? Just going back for you, this is Sven Kramer, the son of Fritz Kramer. And what was his link with this fascist group? Well, his father was Dr. Fritz G.A. Kramer, was the most influential German in the Pentagon from 1952 to 1978. He was a geostrategic advisor to the US Army Chief of Staff in the US Department of Defense, the true Dr. Strangelove, a unique with monocle and walking stick, a last Prussian at the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. He was a German immigrant to USA, born in Essex in 1908 with Christian denomination but Jewish roots. Kramer, an intellectual with 2 PhDs, scraped a living as a farm worker for 5 years, and in 1944 he was conscripted and thus became a US citizen. Kramer discovered and mentored 2 US Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. And so here's the glue. In 1944, he met the 19-year-old soldier Henry Kissinger, who also emigrated from Germany. He formed as Kissinger's Kissinger, his thinking and worldview, and fought with him in the 84th US Infantry Division for the liberation of Europe. Kramer placed young Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig with newly appointed National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger in the White House. The later US Secretary of State describes how this was possible in his contribution to the book. So he is the mentor for Kissinger and Haig. What I did find in my research is that there have been allegations about who Dr. Fritz G.A. Kramer really was of National Security Council NSC and Special Advisor Political and Military Affairs and the Officer Director of Army Staff, Plans Officer, Chief of Staff of US Army had literally taken over the entire Pentagon. Isn't that amazing? The odd things about Dr. Kramer are: 1, he came out of Nazi Germany. 2, in 1945, just after the fall of the Third Reich, he just happened to be stationed with Henry Kissinger at Camp Obermörgergau, Germany, with the Gehlen organization with SS Werner von Braun, the founder of the rocket team and Hitler's chief strategist and war criminal, Waffen SS Brigadier Führer Fritz Kramer. So here's a photograph of an allegation is that Nuremberg War Criminal number 33, Brigadier SS Fritz Kramer, rare photograph of Fritz G.A. Kramer of the US Army Deputy Chief of Staff and NSC. Now, how true this is, but I thought I'd put it up, but it was given by May Brussel. It's Nazi General Fritz Kramer, prisoner number 33, disappeared from the rolls of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and the other US Army Lieutenant Fritz Kramer appeared in Washington, D.C. at the US Pentagon as its Chief Strategist Plans Officer. The great May Brussel and many others believed that they were one and the same person. Now, I can't substantiate this, but I've listened and I've got all the tapes of May Brussel, and she has been spot on with all her investigations into PROMIS, Iran-Contra, and the links of Operation Paperclip and the links of the Nazis being taken out of Germany at the end of the Second World War, to then work in our top scientific and military establishments. And of course, Paperclip was overseen by Peter Grace, head of the Knights of Malta. This article I recovered from the Defence Records. It turns out that Fritz G.A. Kramer is an expert on propaganda, the US propaganda, what it can and can't be. And here are his recommendations for propaganda. An entirely new and essentially non-bureaucratic recruiting procedure should be established for person-to-person propagandists who would serve abroad either as integral components of the USIA, United States Information Agency Organization, or in some cases as individual missionaries, not overtly connected with USIA. The selection of these propagandists must not be based on any formal technical criteria. Don't you love it? The Cercle 6I is set up for propaganda, controlling the media, undermining governments, preventing alternative messages being relayed to the community, controlling the message and perception of the public. And that's his expertise. And he says in this paper, it would in fact be of very great importance if the centre could also become an instrument for the discrete political indoctrination of foreign exchanges in the United States. Since the average United States citizen who meets our foreign visitors is not politically minded, some tactful governmental action should fill the gap. The short one-week orientation courses given most exchanges at the beginning of their time in the country are, of course, merely in the nature of a general briefing, from which lasting political results cannot be expected. In the ultimate analysis, it takes an individual to influence individuals. The overt or covert use of selectees from the proposed research and testing centre to associate with foreign exchanges would be much more than merely a method of testing our future overseas propagandist. He's the father of propaganda. The proposed research and testing centre would originally be staging organisations for a special category of propagandists. Ultimately, it could develop into an institute. I love that. He had the foresight about the foundations and institutes that the CIA establishes for propaganda. Project Democracy, National Endowment for Democracy, Heritage Foundation, etc., with a staff and facilities sufficiently large to examine systematically and comprehensively the entire question of United States propaganda potentialities. This task simply cannot be undertaken by the USIA, which must of needs dedicate its operations rather than meditation. This is an amazing. So it turns out that Sven Kramer, the son of Fritz G.A. Kramer, is a prominent player in the Cercle and the Sixth Eye, with Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, both protégés of his father, and Ted Shackley. Fritz G.A. Kramer, a refugee from Nazi Germany to USA, a member of the conservative establishment, was father of the Cercle visitor Sven Kramer. He had been called the father of provocative weakness theory, more popularly called by neocons as peace through strength. And so here we go. His father and son are leading our neocons. Sven Kramer's father was Fritz G.A. Kramer, a veteran Pentagon policy advisor and sometimes friend of Henry Kissinger. In 1961, he studied at Harvard College, and in 1964 he was awarded a MA from the University of California at Berkeley. He has worked with Frank Colucci. So here we have the neocons. Frank Colucci, the US National Security Advisor. Sven Kramer has worked as a policy advisor to Douglas Faith. Isn't it interesting that my research on PROMIS, follow the money, the technologies, the company corporation documents, official reports of CIA, and on all my experiences and research in Australia have led to the same people who William Hamilton advises me in 2004 that Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Scooter Libby are upset with my research into the PROMIS software. And just a few weeks earlier, it was Robert Booth Nichols that told me that I was upsetting some very powerful Israeli businessmen, and that if I don't stop, I'll have the military coming down on me, or I'd get a crowbar to the back of my head. So Sven Kramer is responsible with his father, peace through strength, the Cold War strategy, integrating defence, nuclear deterrence, modern nation, and arms control, which became the doctrine of President Reagan. In the documents of the Cercle and Sixth Eye, David Teacher goes through all of the records, and it says Sven Kramer's father had been a long-standing Washington insider, German-born. Fritz G.A. Kramer was senior legal advisor to the League of Nations at the League's Legal Institute in Rome. So this is where it comes back to, Italy and Rome, during most of the 1930s, before fleeing to America in 1939, leaving behind his wife and son. That's interesting that he had to flee, but couldn't take his wife and son. He would become a US citizen by joining the US Army's 84th Infantry Division in 1943, a gifted talent scout and teacher, and in 1944 he discovered the young Henry Kissinger, who joined his division. Isn't that interesting that he's leading the division? And he discovers Henry Kissinger. In 1961, he also discovered Alexander Haig, and in 1969 recommended him for military assistant to then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. His son Sven Kramer also served in the Nixon-Kissinger National Security Council from the early 1950s until 1978. When he retired from civil service, he served as a senior civil advisor to the US Army Chief of Staff in Pentagon and influenced the Department of Defense during the Cold War. During his time at Pentagon, he also influenced Secretaries of Defense James Schlesinger and Donald Rumsfeld. Kramer died on September 8, 2003, Washington, D.C., and was buried with full military honours, National Cemetery, October 8th. He was honoured by former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger and former students Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. I repeat that in December 2004, the mysterious Robert Booth Nichols appears in Australia requesting to meet with me, contacts SBS Dateline, who's identified A.B. Krongard. Executive Director of CIA is involved with John Hopkins, the team that had defrauded my companies in Australia. And he threatens me. These are his words. Quote, "Your research is upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and you do not know who you are dealing with until you receive a crowbar to the back of your head. If you continue with your investigations, then you will have the military coming down on you. All your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig." It's interesting that he mentions Alexander Haig in his discussion with me when no one knew that I had discovered that Alexander Haig was a co-director with the 33-degree Mason, who was the attorney to Benka Ambrosiana with Michele Sindona, Robert Calvi and Archbishop Paul Masinkas. Also, later on, I discover when I interview Jimmy Rothstein, he confirms that it was in 2000, during his investigation of Peter Viegnick's purging himself during Michael Riconosciuto's trial, that he denied that he knew Michael Riconosciuto, denied he knew Earl Bryan, denied he knew anything about Hadron Inc. and their companies, working with the Aerostat radar tracking project, owned by a company of Australian media baron Alan Bond, called Airships Industries Inc., that Alexander Haig mysteriously appeared during their investigation, the customs investigation of Peter Viegnick's, and had the investigation shut down. And on the day that Robert Booth Nichols makes those threats, I just got home, I got a telephone call from Marshall Wilson, who was working and covered the story of the United Nations SEAL program, which I was involved with Carlos. And it turns out that he calls me, says, "Guess who's in Australia today?" And I say, "Who?" And he says, "Michael Ledeen is in Melbourne today, and he's speaking at the Australian Institute of International Affairs." I say, "That is amazing. I've just met with a mysterious man that previously owned the Baron of Beith restaurant and guest house in the Dandenongs that was used as a safe house for CIA and Mafia during the Nugenhammack days. He made threats against my life, advised that my research was upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and all my troubles in Australia lead to Alexander Haig. My research into the PROMIS software and P2 Lodge and Banker Ambrosio and BCO confirms that Michael Ledeen works as an advisor to both Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley." And there is the article in the magazine that Marshall Wilson had published. He knew me, and he knew Carlos Morea, who was the head of United Nations Trade Point Development Center for the UN SEAL program, the Secure Electronic Authentication Link for Trade, international trade of all countries and banking, with an encryption key that CIA and NSA do not control. And of course, in my previous podcast, it turns out that we were destroyed by a bogus prince appearing in Australia at the Conference for United Nations Trade Point Secure Electronic Authentication Link, the SEAL program, which was established with my R&D companies with the Australian federal government endorsements and support. And they sent a bogus prince promising a gift of $1.4 billion to set up a foundation to help the poorer countries. His name was Prince Haji, or Prince Haji Aldik, Van Aldik. And there is confirmation that on the same day, 6th of December, the guest speaker was Dr. Michael Ledeen from the American Enterprise Institute, and his talk was US foreign policy in the age of terrorism in Melbourne, the same day that Robert Booth Nichols meets with me to make his threats. And of course, in the memoirs of Dwayne Claridge, A Spy for All Seasons, he confirms that Michael Ledeen is his personal friend, and that Michael Ledeen played a critical role as an advisor to Ted Shackley and Alexander Haig, and was the person that arranged the meeting of manager Gorbanafar with Ted Shackley for setting up the Iran-Contra TOWS missile deal with the BCCI checks financed by the Kuwait royal family, with Robert Sensi working for the chairman of Kuwait Airlines, the member of the royal family of Kuwait, and also is the director of BCCI. And it reveals that Michael Ledeen and the Terror Network, My Life in the CIA by Dwayne Claridge. Dwayne Claridge, a long-time CIA field agent, an administrator who was pardoned by George H.W. Bush for his role in the Iran-Contra affair, describes Michael Ledeen as a fine journalist, a scholar and a friend. He noted that the CIA took a dim view of individuals such as Michael Ledeen and retired CIA officer Theodore Shackley, who freelanced with foreign intelligence services, particularly Italian intelligence and Mossad. Michael Ledeen, Theodore Shackley were the best friends of Italian intelligence and Mossad. In 1980, Ledeen and Shackley teamed up to provide war games type training for the European intelligence services, including Italy's intelligence service. So there's your link. Claridge explains that Ledine's damage to Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign by trumping up the Billy-Gaddafi relationship earned the appreciation of Alexander Haig and other prominent Republicans. He's a key player for the events to discredit Jimmy Carter. Claridge wrote that Ledine further aggravated the CIA by becoming an unofficial conduit between Haig and General Giuseppe Santovito, head of Italian military service, known as SISMI. Claridge notes that in 1987, as he retired from the agency after being formally reprimanded, it was his friend, Michael Ledine, who used connections with a prominent General Dynamics shareholder to introduce Claridge to General Dynamics executives who offered him a position at the company. So isn't Michael Ledine helpful? Helpful and advisor to Ted Shackley, helpful and advisor to Alexander Haig, and then helpful to Dwayne Claridge after he's been indicted and charged with his role in the Iran-Contra affair. And so finally, in my interviews with Jimmy Rothstein, his credibility, he arrested CIA assassin Frank Sturgis during the Watergate scandal. He investigated US Customs evidence involving Peter Wiedniks and Michael Riconosciuto. He investigated CIA Operation Human Compromise of blackmail using pedophiles involving Roy Cohen and Ed Wilson. He received a telephone call from, and wait for this part's going to be important for this whole podcast to come, Pope Paul I, 2 weeks before his mysterious death, requesting that Jimmy Rothstein will investigate evidence of the pedophiles in the Catholic Church and investigate overwhelming evidence of fraud within the Vatican Bank. Even though I haven't typed that there, it's in my recorded interviews with Jimmy and it's relevant to this complete podcast. And this is what he says in his interview that I've recorded with him. I was hired as an undercover investigator by Alexander Magnus, US presidential candidate, to investigate overwhelming evidence that his foundation was being used by Oliver North and neo-Nazi fascist Tom Posse. I was hired as an undercover investigator by US Customs to investigate evidence that Peter Wiedniks had purged himself during Michael Riconosciuto's court trial. During our investigation of Peter Wiedniks, we were shocked when Alexander Haig suddenly and mysteriously intervened and shut down the whole US Customs investigation into Peter Wiedniks. So that is further proof that my investigations as PROMIS leads to Alexander Haig, the neocons, and all the other evidence of BCCI, Nugenham Bank, the loans affair that destroyed the Whitlam government that Danny CASOLARO was investigating. And of course, in summary, previous podcasts, I proved that where Michael was working at the Cabazon, together with his business partner Paul Marascus, who was murdered, and the links that they had with CIA Michael Hand for laundering gold bullion through Nugenham Bank, was linked to Meridian Arms with Robert Nichols, Wackenhut Cabazon Arms Manufacturing, the Cabazon Casino set up by John P. Nichols and financed by Thomas Marsden with the Gambino Mafia in New York, was the vehicle for laundering the drugs and arms together with CIA and Office of Naval Intelligence Task Force 157 with Peter Briggs, owner of Southern Goldfields, for processing the gold bullion, and Hamilton Proprietary Limited with Donald Lockyer, who was involved with the mafia, the Nugenham Bank, and the Gambino's Mafia Knights of Malta Foundation that had diplomatic passports for them to move from country to country with satchels under diplomatic clearance that could not be checked by customs to transfer funds, money and drugs into Australia and the United States.